Hello, welcome to the last session in this class in the Classics of Christian Devotion. We're going to deal with the last 5 of the little booklets in your series, and this time we're dealing with authors writing in the latter part of the 1800s or the 19th century on into the 20th century, ending with the last one, Bonhoeffer, about the middle of the century. And we're going to begin with a Danish writer, one of the great theologians of the 19th century, Søren Kierkegaard. He's famous for his phrase, or it's attributed to him, his leap into faith. I think a little bit of background is necessary in order to understand what kind of context he lived and wrote in. There's a personal context, but there's also a theological context. Let me take the theological one first. He came along at a time when the liberal or higher critical theological positions were pretty well established and being trained in theology in that area, and yet he was enough of a poet, or I'm not sure what, a romantic we shall say, that his soul was starved, because that kind of theology doesn't warm you very much, doesn't inform you, doesn't bring you very close to God. In fact, it makes God nearly unapproachable and unreachable. And so his famous leap into faith literally was a leap over all of the intellectual barriers that his theology had placed in front of him, a leap into faith. Some say he leaped so far that he leapt into mysticism. Hence, he is included in some of the mystic writers. But there's not a solid biblical base for a lot of his experience. But now, to understand some of his other contexts, that is his personal, he was born about 1813, and when he was born, his father was 57 years old. For some reason, his early upbringing, he got a very gloomy outlook on life, very pessimistic, and very pessimistic about himself. He was constantly denigrating himself and most humans. He reacted against a number of things. He reacted against formalized Christianity, of which there was a lot in Denmark, where he, of course, was born and was raised. He reacted against a lot of other kinds of forms of religion and philosophical belief. He was sort of a rebellious person in that sense, but very dissatisfied with his own performance and with the performance of the church around him, and believed that all of the trappings of formal religion didn't amount to very much. So it's in this setting that we come upon the writings of Kierkegaard, and I'll begin with the first question that you have there in your syllabus. And the question that I've asked is, what difference does it make whether Christ says, "Come hither unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, I will give you rest"? And he says this in on page 9 of the little booklet, if you want to turn there with us on this. He said, who is this inviter, Jesus Christ? Which Jesus Christ? The Jesus Christ who sits in glory at the right hand of the Father? No. From the seat of his glory he has not spoken one word. Therefore it is Jesus Christ in his humiliation, in the state of humiliation, who spoke these words. And he goes on to say, is Jesus Christ not always the same? And I think there are various states of manifestation of Jesus Christ. But he makes the point that when Jesus spoke these words, as listed there in Matthew 11, he was in the flesh, in the body of his humiliation. Does it make a difference, the things that Jesus said in his body, in the flesh, before his exaltation, and the things that might be said from his place of exaltation? We'll talk to Deborah over here on the end about that. What do you think about that, Deborah? Does that make any difference to you?
I don't think it makes a difference. In the Old Testament, it says in Isaiah 57:15, I believe, God said that he dwelt in a high and holy place with him who was of a contrite and humble spirit, to revive those who were humble. And I think that Jesus always had a humble spirit, whether he's sitting at the right hand of God or whether he was here in the flesh. I think that he is approachable under either circumstances. He's our high priest, and we can come to him. He is the same. And I think, though, that what the point Kierkegaard was trying to make to me was that when we when we have needs, and when we maybe have sinned and we have need of forgiveness, we don't need the concept necessarily of someone who is holy and righteous and one who is a God of judgment, so much as perhaps a concept of God in his humiliation, as someone who is of a contrite and humble spirit and who will receive us in our place of humiliation.
I think it's a good point. I think that's what Kierkegaard was talking about, is that we get more help. The reason why Jesus came and humbled himself was so that we might be able to identify with him. It's difficult, in other words, for us to identify with a transcendent God that you can't even approach, who's so awesome and so holy, when we're having trouble with just rather mundane human problems. But to realize that it was the Christ of humiliation who suffered as we suffered all the things, and that helps us. It's not so much that God needs to do that, is that we need it. And I think that's what he's talking about, is that Christ came down here. God didn't speak from a throne ex cathedra. He didn't speak from the blinding glory of his awesome transcendence, but he spoke as a root out of dry ground, an humble person. He shed himself of all of that. And so that's why he was saying that it was more accessible to him. Yeah, I think so. Well, let's go on here to the second question. Do you agree or disagree with Kierkegaard that we can only love God by suffering? That may be an oversimplification. What does this say to Christians who have known little personal sufferings? He said a little bit further on down the page, about the second, third, said, if thou lovest him as he would be loved, thou wilt have suffering. Remember, one lives only once. If that is let slip, if thou hast experienced no suffering, if thou hast shirked it, it is eternally irredeemable. And he speaks about to love God is to suffer. Anybody want to comment on that? That sounds kind of negative, or maybe it's covering up something we haven't looked to at the front there. Would you like to talk about that?
Well, I believe one aspect of it is this, that the Bible tells you that if you love God, you're going to keep his commandments. And a lot of times to keep his commandments, you've got to do some suffering. I know I do.
The flesh sure suffers.
The flesh sure suffers, right. And I think that that was my interpretation of what he was saying.
Anybody, you want to comment on it over here, David?
Well, that was my line of thinking as well, that certainly one would suffer from loving God, but I think the emphasis should not be on the fact that you can't love him by not suffering. The emphasis is loving your neighbor, and that's how you love God, and by keeping his commands. He said, if you love me, you'll keep my words. And I think that is where the emphasis is, and then the suffering and the persecution would be a natural fallout of that first directive to love me. Will you love your neighbor? How can you love each other, not love each other, and love me at the same time, I think is where I would place the emphasis.
Yeah, over and over in Jesus' life and ministry, he put love of God not just as other than love of the world, but as a direct confrontation, at enmity with the world. That very often to love God, you had to hate other things by comparison. That a lot of people have a problem thinking in terms of hating, like family and a number of other things. Of course, we know how that's to be interpreted right there. Anybody else want to comment on what does this say to Christians who have, if you haven't suffered in your Christian life, what does that say about your relationship to God? Does it say anything there? Anybody want to comment on that? Josh?
Well, it seems like there's a little lack of maturing that needs to take place. I think if we're not willing to embrace the suffering that comes from God, we'll never know the joy of the enduring and getting on the other side and finding the glory of God in it.
The well done.
The well done, yeah. Romans 5:3 says we're to rejoice in our suffering because sufferings produce perseverance and character and patience and hope.
Yeah, the Bible says that Jesus learned obedience
Through suffering.
by the things that he suffered. And so it would indicate that if we haven't suffered a lot, we're probably not very obedient, and our view of God is more of a kind of a religiously oriented thing. It certainly doesn't have anything with a lot of basic bedrock reality. Anybody else want to comment on that? I think it's clear to most of us that when you love something, you're going to be in for some suffering, because you can't control the things or the persons that you love. I remember when I was a young child, we had a little fox terrier, and we had him for 7 or 8 years. And finally, he got a disease, distemper, I think it was, and we nursed him through some agonizing time. And finally, the little dog died, and I swore that I never was going to get another dog or love another dog again. Well, I didn't do that. I didn't follow through on that, but the reason why I did that was because I loved that dog. And when you love something, and anything happens to it or disappoints you or whatever, then you're in for some suffering. Now, that's not exactly. God suffers because he loves us. And that's clear. The cross is because God loved us. And if we are imbued with the Spirit of God, then we, as we progress along the way, we're going to suffer in our hearts over the sin of the world and the lack of response of the world to God, just like in other words, we're going to take on somewhat the burdens of God as we enter into his Spirit. In fact, that's the heart of intercession, as we're going to find out in one of the other writers here just a little bit longer. Anybody else want to comment on those thoughts there before we go on to something else? Josh?
Well, 2 Corinthians 1 says that, a part of our suffering is so that we can help other people. That if we suffer, we can in turn comfort someone else who's going through or needs to go through in a suffering period. So it's really a part of ministry that you're talking about.
Yeah. All right. Let's go on to the third one here. And what does it mean that God will not suffer himself to be transformed by men and be a nice human God? Now, this is on page 22, and is where he starts this. He said, with this invitation to all them that labor and are heavy laden, Christianity did not come into the world as an admirable example of the general art of consolation, but as the absolute. And he goes on to say in the next sentence there, God will not suffer himself to be transformed by man and be a nice human God. He will transform men, and that he wills out of love. Rather than that, the way we react to God, we want to transform God. We want to make him into our expectations, I think, is some of the things that he's talking about. Anybody want to comment on that? Okay, John?
Well, I just put down that some people try to treat God like Santa Claus.
That's appropriate as this is being taped.
Right.
This is 2 weeks before Christmas.
But on the other hand, God has given us his word, and his word is good, and we are able to rely on what he's given us in his word. So. But you have to kind of walk the tightrope when you're going in that area.
That's right. Yeah. Anybody else want to comment on that?
Well, I guess what I put down was, I kind of felt like he was saying that, God is the absolute, and we might not understand everything about him. We don't really understand totally his nature or why he does things, but God's not going to change who he is because we don't understand. and He's not going to change just to fit our ideas of who we think He should be. And as far as transforming guys, like we always want God to be more like us. And witnessing to people I've worked with, they're like, well, it's not a very perfect God if He's just like us, or if He has anger, or if He, because Bible talks about God was angry and that kind of stuff. And they're like, well, He must not be much of a God if He's that much like us. Yeah. And that's just a wrong conception of how God is, and that's what seems like people try to do. And they're like, well, how can He be a just God if He allows all these bad things to happen? And, that kind of stuff. So to me, that was kind of what He was addressing.
It's very difficult for us to avoid looking at God or thinking about God in terms of human qualities. It's what we call anthropomorphisms. In fact, the Bible is full of them, where we say that God has God's eyes or God's hands, and I think we know He doesn't really have physical hands, but that's about the only way we can describe the actions of God, and yet God as Spirit is indescribable. And very often we put God in a bad light by the way we represent Him. I think we have trivialized the nature of God a lot in the charismatic movement. Some of the faith teaching, or the way that many people have received it, has made God, as John suggested, as a giant celestial Santa Claus whose main concern is supplying our needs. And yet that's not what any of these writers that we've been studying for some time have said at all. And when we really begin to follow God, then we flow and we learn about God, and we begin to understand God, and we flow into His purposes. And the more we do that, the less we're concerned about whether we get something out of the deal, so to speak, or what return there is to us. It's just, as some of the writers that we've read this time, the notion of just loving God and fellowshipping with God was the height of nearly any kind of endeavor there. Isaiah 55, 8 and 9, God is speaking in that passage through the prophet Isaiah and says, my ways are higher than your ways, as the heavens are above the earth. What God is saying, that's a magnificent passage that speaks of the transcendence of God, that God is so other than we are. There's no hope for us to understand Him, and until He reveals Himself. And we must pay attention to how God reveals Himself. And sometimes God reveals Himself in somewhat human-like qualities, and that's reasonable, because He's trying to identify and communicate with human beings. And it does no good for God to reveal Himself to us in categories that we have no possibility of understanding. So, but nevertheless, we've got to realize that because God tries to pour Himself down into our brains, that doesn't mean that God is limited by our brains. Shouldn't be in any sense like that. All right, let's go on to the next writer here, which is the writings of Evelyn Underhill. I'll have to say that a number of the students here, I won't identify which ones, didn't identify a lot with Kierkegaard, and that's all right. There are some things that I identify with his frustration. I identify with his dislike and frustration with institutional religion and state churches and all of that sort of thing. I've never been involved in a state church, but I've been around it enough to know the strictures of it there. And like most people, there was an intense yearning in Kierkegaard to fly free of the limitations of ordinary Christianity. And if he hadn't been so basically pessimistic, he probably could have come into a little bit more positiveness in his expression there. Well, let's go to Evelyn Underhill now. There's several books that she wrote. One is a classic in the field if you're interested in the whole subject of mysticism, and there's a book just by that title. It's quite a compendium of the mystical writings, and she lived over the turn of the century and on into the 40s. About 1921, she underwent a transformation in her approach, and whereas before she was more outwardly oriented in her thinking and her writing. Something happened and she began to be more internally focused and concerning the inner life. In fact, a book that she wrote in 1926 of that title, Concerning the Inner Life, is an excellent book. Her writings on meditations and prayers I would recommend very highly. And then her collected papers, and some of in the little book right here, they've got some of her letters to persons that she's giving some advice to. But she is probably of this century one of the greats in that, and I usually get a good deal out of her writings. We've asked these questions here. What in your experience would make you agree with Underhill's claim that we have a lopsided Christianity? You know that's in the 20th century with a phrase like that, but I think every one of us understand. In the country where I grew up, we call it whopsided. So I see Josh over there smiling too. I think that sounds like what they said over there where he came from. Josh is from North Carolina. I think the paragraph after that is, well, in paragraph 1 on page 10, she says, I feel more and more the danger in which we stand of developing a lopsided Christianity, so concentrated on service, on this world obligations, as to forget the needs of constant willed and quiet contact with that other world, wherefrom the sanctions of service and the power in which to do it proceed. Then she goes on to say, by explication, she says, we mostly spend those lives conjugating 3 verbs: to want, to have, and to do. And then she uses some synonymous expressions there: craving, clutching, and fussing on the material, political, social, emotional, intellectual, even on the religious plane. We are kept in perpetual unrest, forgetting that none of these verbs has ultimate significance. I thought that was good. Wanting, having, and doing will finally culminate in the hereafter, and those things we're not going to be that much concerned with, except so far as they are transcended by and included in the fundamental verb to be. That being, not wanting, having, and doing, is the essence of the spiritual life. You might underline that in your little book right there. That being, not wanting, having, and doing, is the essence of a spiritual life. Now, she would be the first to say that it's not just being alone, that, of course, these other things, particularly the doing, should flow out of it. But our problem is in the churches that we spend so much time doing and getting other people to do that they have very little time to be. And that's been the lesson of this whole matter here. What in your own experience would make you agree with Underhill's claim that we have a lopsided Christianity? Did anybody want to comment on that first off there? That we seem all right. Deborah over there on the end.
Well, in my experience, I think there's the lack of power amongst Christians in what they do, and a lack of the evidence of fruit in what they do, to me would indicate that Christianity is somewhat lopsided in charismatic circles.
Mm-hmm.
But those 2 evidences to me would indicate that lopsidedness.
Mm-hmm. What about in your own life? Have there been periods of time where you could agree with that? You identify with this?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. Definitely. Definitely.
Anybody else you want to comment on that?
Yes, I guess this is what, confessional time? Is that kind of what?
Well, it's been 5 weeks of confessional time.
In my own experience, I definitely would agree, because since I've been here in school, there have been a lot of times where I've gotten so busy with working and schoolwork and all that kind of stuff that I really neglected my personal relationship with God. And there have been times where I haven't read my Bible for several days, or I haven't prayed at all for a long period of time. And it's just because just the daily routine of going to work all day and then going to class and then studying and but it's even working in the church. That even gets you get busy doing things in the church. I've had that happen, and it just all kind of overwhelms my personal relationship and personal time with the Lord.
Well, it's quite true that ministry at times can be the enemy of the spiritual life. And that has been very tragically underscored in the lives of some very prominent ministers, particularly in the charismatic movement. Ministry is so exciting, it can be overwhelming. There were times when I was very much involved in it in the church in Louisville that I felt like I was going to be drowned in ministry. And for periods of time, I quite understood why Jesus had to move away from the crowds, even in the midst of very successful ministry at times. And if he needed to get alone and just be in the presence of the Father, then how much more we need that same sort of thing. And I think that's the basic lesson of a lot of the mystical writers, is that all ministry and service has got to grow out of our relationship to God. And the being that we have with God is the very core and the root and the supply of everything that we do for God. But we get it up the other way around. We think that if we will minister more for God, or we're busier for God, that somehow we'll be more spiritual. No, we just become more religious. And that's not the same thing. Do you want to comment on that, John?
Well, I recall that one of the earlier writers made the statement that you need to fill up the vessel before you can discharge anything.
That's right, or you have a dry run. All right, let's go on here. She makes a little bit later on in page 16, she makes a statement that intercession, underline intercession because that's a type of prayer, is the great fabric of praying souls, the mystical body through which the work of Christ on earth goes on being done. Now the question is, what are the implications for this view for your personal prayer? I guess that would indicate how much of intercession you involve in and how important you consider it. Anybody want to comment on that? Also, what are the implications for prayer in the church? You might characterize what a lot of prayer is today in the church or in a lot of people's personal life. What is it for? And go on from there. Anybody want to comment? You want to comment on that, Josh?
Well, my focus is really defined in missions. My church is 50-some families in 20 countries, and I've been to visit all these people, and my heart goes out to the country as well, to the missionary family. I spend a lot of my time more or less praying for them, believing that God's going to work through them and get His will done, in those countries. I know that if a lot of the work that I see that should be going on depended on intercession on the whole, I think we're in a lot of trouble. Yeah. Because there's not a lot of people that I would consider doing a lot of true interceding, maybe for the church or for whatever, unless it's their own personal needs. And if you can't get outside your own personal self to get out to pray for the work, you're missing it, I think. Yeah. But I'm work oriented. Yeah. I've been to these places and I see the need to intercede. And if I'm in a country, the most quality thing I can do is spend hours a day in prayer. Mm-hmm. When I was on the mission field, we spent the first 2 or 3 hours every morning praying and reading. We didn't do anything else. We had company. It didn't matter who it was. When Bob Bishop came over, he thought we were mad at him for 4 days because we wouldn't speak to him the first 2.5, 3 hours every morning. Yeah. But then we'd go out and do a lot of radical things. Mm-hmm. But it was because we were full, we were charged, we were ready to go get them, and we could go out and do some pretty radical stuff in the middle of the night in Manila and you see people get saved.
It's my feeling that there needs to be a basic shift in the focus of prayer in the charismatic movement, or any movement, any renewal movement for that matter, because we become enamored with the fact that God does answer prayer, and so we have a great number of needs ourselves. And in fact, this church, as well as many other churches here in the beginning of the end of the 1991, is in some trouble. And we pray, oh, God, help us, send this, send that, or bring this. And yet that's not the heart of God. The heart of God is intercession. And in our progress through the tabernacle, furniture of the tabernacle. It's late in the progression towards the ultimate, which is union with God there in the Holy of Holies. And just before you enter into that ultimate experience, there is the altar of incense, which is the altar of intercession. And prior to that, at the table of showbread and other things, we've thanked God for the bread and the water and the things of life and all of this. But when we really get in near the heart of God, we're going to be interceding. We're going to be praying for nations and for people and things that really touch the very core of the heart of God. And I think that's very important, and I think that's what she's seeing in this. And the prayer warriors that I have read after, these are the ones that engage mostly in intercessory prayer. And if we do that, if we ask that the will of God be done in these matters out there, then Jesus said, you know, your Heavenly Father knows what you have need of. He'll take care of that. We don't have to spend near as much time begging and pleading God for, you know, daily bread or other kinds of things that we want. Yes, John, do you want to comment on that?
That called to mind about the intercession, that a tape that I've listened to recently by Kenneth Hagin, where he was talking about in the early 1940s, he would find himself, all of a sudden, he'd wake up and he'd be in the middle of the living room in the cold. You know, he didn't have any heat in there, and he'd be on his knees praying maybe for 3-4 hours every night.
Yeah.
And he didn't know exactly what he was praying for. But at one point, just before the end of World War II, he was told by the Spirit of God that not only himself, but many others, that the Spirit of God had called them to intercede, and that the results of their intercession would be the healing revival that came right after World War II.
Yeah, we were involved in a lot of that, and we as being as sensitive to the Spirit as we were awakened in the middle of the night a lot of times to pray for a person or for a situation that we found out it was a common thing then. I don't know, our focus has seemed to have gotten diffused here in recent years, and we're not quite as sensitive, and I have to confess that I'm not as sensitive to the Spirit in those matters. But whenever something is brought to you to pray for, to intercede for something, do it. Do it then, and you'll find that your sensitivity to the Spirit and things like that will increase. Well, she also makes some recommendations about daily devotional times. Of course, there are all kinds of different ones, but she's talking about spending an hour and dividing it into 3 periods of 20 minutes each. The first be given to a short New Testament reading and meditation, then in prayer with adoration, intercession, and going over the day and getting God's help for the things that you think you're going to be doing. And then the third 20 minutes or the last 20 minutes in spiritual reading, which she interprets to be the writings of other spiritual writers with which she was greatly familiar in her day. What do you think about that? Did you see anything in that you need to change in your situation, or would you, or what? Anybody want to comment on that? John?
Well, I thought it was an excellent example. The only thing I would modify at the expense of some of the spiritual reading, I would spend time praying in tongues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought of that too. Anybody else? For my own part, as far as spiritual writings is concerned, I don't tend to read that every day. I take spells at it, and maybe we'll read through a whole book, and maybe once a week or something like that. And the regular times I tend to read both out of the Old Testament. I read in the Proverbs every day and some Psalms, and then some of the New Testament, and then spend the rest of the time in prayer. But I do read in some spiritual writings, but not necessarily every day. It's hard to keep up with that just 20 minutes a day. I like to get a whole thought. Anybody else want to comment on that part of it there?
I think it's just important that we do it.
Yeah.
I know it's hard, you know. Todd was talking about getting caught up in school, and I remember being here in school, and it was some tough nights and tough days. But there was a discipline that God put me on early on, and that was to get up and do it. There's been very few days, that I haven't had the opportunity, unless I'm on the field and we've been out all night doing work or whatever, to get up. Some of the most dynamic, on-fire works that I know of out in the world right now comes from churches and pastors and their workers who are up early, 5:30 every morning, praying the first couple of hours a day, doing, real warfare. They're not just saying, "Oh, God bless my church." They're chasing devils out of their territories. And we're seeing conversions by the hundreds in some places. But doing it is the key to me. You've got to do it, whether you feel like doing it or not. To me, it may just be duty. I don't know. But I feel guilty, or I feel the day just works much better when I've had my time, regardless of how I get it and when I get it. And I'm thinking about pressing in for 30 more minutes and coming to work late.
One of the saints I remember said, the busier I get, the more I cannot do without that hour or so of prayer at the beginning of the day. All right, let's go on to William Temple. We're just a few minutes behind right here. We'll try to get on over this. William Temple was an unusual man. He was a man of great intellect. He was an English clergyman. And that may not do him justice, because he was rare for a man of that ecclesiastical surrounding. In fact, he wound up being the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is the equivalent, I guess, of the Pope in the Anglican Church. It's the most important see or chair in the most important church in the Anglican Church. It's interesting that I don't know of any other Archbishop of Canterbury whose father also was the Archbishop of Canterbury. It's quite unusual. But he was quite a religious young man and very obedient and all the rest. But he was very, very intellectual, but it also says he was a tremendous man of prayer. And I have always gotten great benefit out of reading his writings. He was born right near the end of the last century and died in the mid-40s there in England. And on page 8 in the little booklet right here, he makes some statements that I pick up on. He said, "Is it realistic to say we cannot always be thinking even about Christ, but we can refuse to dwell on any thoughts which are out of tune with Him?" How might this attitude be helpful in your own life? What do you think he's saying there? What do you think he's talking about? I think he's trying to find a practical way, short of the highly religious and probably impractical notion that you can think about Christ all the time, 24 hours a day. I don't think anybody thinks you can do that in the forefront of your consciousness and all like that. What is he talking about there? Do you want to comment on that, Todd?
Yeah, I think the first thing that came to my mind when I read that was Brother Lawrence's practicing the presence of Christ, that type idea where, I think, we get busy doing other things during the day, so we're not necessarily always thinking about the Lord, but I think we also have a choice as far as what we allow our minds to dwell on. I think that's part of the renewing of the mind. And so I think it's something we need to do is, if we're doing something and our mind isn't on the Lord, and then something comes in that's not of God, that's when we can actually stop our thoughts and get our thoughts back on the Lord. And so it's our minds are our minds. I think we can control as far as we have an ability to be able to stop the thoughts that come in and focus our mind on something else.
This matter of refusing to dwell on thoughts that are out of tune with Christ, is there anything in our society or our culture you think that makes that more difficult today than it was perhaps in his age?
Well, considering all the sensory input that we get from everything that is so ungodly, the television, the billboards, newspaper ads, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
So
that has some implications then for our lives and our habits then, if that is. What would you think about that? Is this very important for spirituality? Is it practical today? How would you face a whole church full of people who really not? How would you express this sort of thing to them? You want to talk about that, Deborah?
Well, I think it's really important that you catch your thoughts early and quickly. Otherwise, I think you may only pick up and get your mind renewed in prayer. It might take some time in prayer to get freed from thoughts that you've allowed in. To me, it's just essential. It's essential that you don't allow negative thoughts. It's thoughts that are ungodly to dwell in you. It's just essential. Because most of our thoughts that are ungodly come from the devil, and I believe that that we can live in ungodliness due to the thoughts that we allow in our mind day by day, and really miss the will of God, and really miss doing His work and living in His character. And I think it's essential, and I think it's essential for all those reasons, and particularly myself. There are certain thought patterns that I find that if I don't get quickly, that they will get a hold of me, and that it takes prayer to get them off me.
You know, the frightening thing to me is that if we, and very few of us today are able to control all of this, or to keep from dwelling on thoughts which are out of tune with Christ. I mean, they're forced on us from here to there, and the practical result of that is, I doubt seriously that we can think rightly about Christ, and we substitute for that sort of religious thinking and religious practice. If we have allowed the well springs of our own spirit to be poisoned, in other words, by these things, then we're fooling ourselves to think that we can go to church and sing songs of great spiritual import and have them mean anything. And I think the reason is that we have not guarded the avenues of our sensory perceptions in our mind during the week, and we try to make up for it on Sunday, and we become just more religiously active rather than spiritually perceptive in that sort of thing. And so I think it's a kind of a frightening thing as far as that's concerned. Do you agree with Temple's definition of the church as the nucleus of the universal fellowship of love and the chief means of its establishment? Let me kind of bring this up into modern language a little bit here. The church is, above many things, it is a fellowship, and it is a fellowship of love of Christ, of people who love Christ. And so what he's saying here, he speaks of the church as the nucleus or the focal point of that. The church is where this is realized. Now, it's not clear to me whether he's talking about the church as a denomination, or as a larger body, or as the local church. He's probably talking about both. And then he goes on to be a little bit more specific, and he says that the church is the chief means of establishing this universal fellowship of love. The church has been battered a good bit in recent years, and there's been a proliferation of what we call parachurch ministries. In fact, this seminary is a parachurch ministry. Globe Missionary Evangelism is a parachurch ministry. There are those who would say that the parachurch ministry is just as much a church as the church is. I doubt that. And there's been an uneasy relationship between these ministries and the local church. And the local church is really on hard times recently. I think it's due for revival, because I think there's no substitute for the church. Christ, after all, died for the church. But nevertheless, he speaks of the church. This is the place. And of course, there's in the charismatic movement, there's been a lot of lone rangers, as we know, that ride across the range, you know, thinking you don't have to go to church to be spiritual, because after all, I've got the Holy Ghost. And they ride across the range, the Lone Ranger, without Tonto, and probably in some cases without even silver. They think they're going somewhere, and they're not getting anywhere much. But what do you think of his, does this definition fit your own church? Or maybe we ought to just spread that around and not just say the ones that, of course, we've got several churches represented here. But from you out there, how would you say, is your church a nucleus? Is it a focal point for developing this whole matter of a fellowship of love? Or is it just a fellowship of people who have like backgrounds and culture and that sort of thing? Anybody want to comment on that? I've said a lot about it and probably fuzzed up a lot of the focus on it. Anybody want to comment? John?
Well, the way I look at it is that the church, our local church, is the light in our community. And our church is there for the purpose of winning the lost in our community and bringing them into this fellowship of love.
Then it would be very important for them to see something in the relationship of the members that they can't see anywhere else. In other words, a relationship of love. Isn't that what they said with amazement about the first church? What did they say? See how they love one another. And that was the compelling motivation, the compelling recommendation of that local church. Not that they spoke with great skill, not even that there was a lot of miracles that occurred, although they did occur. But the thing that touched the world was see how they really love one another. What do you think about the church in today's world as far as that is concerned? Have we emphasized other things? And do you think that love one for another, that kind of fellowship that's in Jesus, and not just because we are all sort of scrubbed and washed in the same cultural climate? You want to comment on that some more, or you want to pass it on down there to Josh?
Well, I see, love emanating in certain ways, but I think what you're talking about to me is if Todd's got a need, I haven't gone out and sold my car yet and laid the money at your feet so you can disperse it to him like
they did in the first church.
Yeah, in Acts chapter 5. There's a minimal amount of that going on. Our society is, we're very materialistic. We're very greed, mine and mine and mine oriented. Just speaking from my own experience, I guess, I've not done that. Done a lot of other things, but I give to the poor, but not to an extreme, like they did.
All within reasonable bounds.
All within reasonable bounds, yes, but not like they did, to where they saw the overwhelming whole, and they brought it all in and they dispersed it out. So,
I guess I don't know how to put this. I hate to be the Grinch that spoils Christmas or anything like that, and I guess I have a kind of well, I won't say I have a negative look at things like that, but I am disturbed by a number of things, and I've been accused of speaking prophetically before, having a prophetic edge to my teaching. But I'm a little concerned about the tendency in the church today to talk a lot about loving people, but not doing it necessarily. We talk a lot about that. We say in church, well, we all love one another, and this, that, and the other. And there's always been a temptation in the church from the beginning in religious circles to think that if you say something, that's the same as doing it. And that's not true. And we probably ought to talk less and do more when it gets on that level. And we know what we ought to do, and we think if we just say that we're doing that, and we could fool ourselves in that thing. And I think that's what these kind of people are talking about right there. Would you add anything? Well, of course, John added to the definition of the church in this by talking about it's a light in the community that's to reach out. But we cannot reach out beyond, we cannot commend what we are beyond what our relationship is together. And that relationship has got to be not just a relationship that's born of circumstances, fortuitous circumstances that throw us together, but of the relationship that we have with God personally. That's why we relate together. That's why we love one another. Well, if Temple rightly says that for transformation of life we need not state legislation, but a true conversion of individuals, is he's saying that we cannot legislate morality. Now, there's several things here. It's amazing to me that someone who was the chief exponent of a state church, which in England, I don't know whether it's, I haven't really thought about that recently, but if you're born in England, you're born into the state church. Now, you may join other churches or be a part of other churches, but everybody by law is a member. Is that still true, Deborah? Is it it's not true in Canada, I'm sure. But as far as the Anglican church is concerned, in the state church, it's the definition of everybody's born into the state church. And for him to say that it's not state legislation, but that the individuals need to be converted as an Anglican archbishop is to really commend his spirituality, his understanding of what's going on. But I don't know that he's saying that we cannot legislate morality. Do anybody want to comment on that?
Well, I guess the way I looked at what he was saying was that he was speaking of a life that's transformed into a life that seeks to serve others, namely the human race. You know, he's speaking of a life that's characterized by sacrifice, and he says that a life transformed into a life of sacrifice and service will not occur by state legislation, but by true conversion of the individual, which is true. And but I mean, no, I don't think he's really trying to get at legislating morality through the state.
Let me ask you kind of a sneaky question right here. Can you? That's a big question today. Everybody, when they're talking about what these various groups are trying to do to promote more more morality in our nation, say, well, you can't legislate morality. Can you legislate morality?
It's already being done.
Sure, anything. Sure you can. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to make moral persons, but you can make the nation or the streets safe for some citizens if you punish immorality. And there has to be some sort of standard. And surely we can agree that one person ought not to kill another, in the public school system. We'll start there. But you can. In fact, morality has always been legislated. And it doesn't make spiritual persons, but it makes an orderly society, and we're after that, if nothing else. So I think that's somebody ought to answer that. I'm waiting for somebody to say, sure, we can legislate morality. But that's not going to make a good person out of you, but it'll make somebody that'll allow me to live in some safety and and some order in society. That's not really what he's pointing out at that point anyhow in the book. Well, let's go on here so maybe we can finish up this session with the writings of Thomas Kelly. Thomas Kelly's kind of a sleeper. I don't know. Had any of you ever heard of him before you read in these little books? Anybody? He is was a kind of a contemporary of Elton Trueblood, who is also called the Quaker philosopher, who also taught at Earlham College. I read a good bit after Trueblood when I was in seminary and still pick him up occasionally. But Thomas Kelly was one of those persons who came out of a Quaker background and understood the need for silence in approaching God and a very unstructured approach. He was a highly educated man, and as you read the little introduction right here, and held some high positions in the various colleges, Haverford even and Earlham a little bit early on, and he lived on past towards the middle of the century of this present century, and he was always stressing that our practice needed to match our profession. And he was given to the inner life, and he went through a sort of a crisis period. He's always a good person and a spiritual person, but he went through a crisis in mid-profession that was very noticeable to his friends and resulted in a tremendous, almost mystical approach to the presence of God in that. Now, on page 16, he talks about these recreating silences. He said, how do you understand the term the recreating, that is, the silences that recreate our inner spirit. Do you agree that most of us need times of silence in which to draw close to God? And I might just kind of put it this way: what experiences have you had of just purposeful silence in the presence of God or in your devotional life? You want to comment on that, John?
Well, I find it absolutely essential in my prayer life. I mean, if I just do all the talking, that's not really fellowship. It's one-sided.
Yeah.
I've got to spend some time listening and sitting in silence and quiet and very little, try to get away from distractions as much as possible. But I just have to do this every day, just simply to sit in God's presence. Bible often refers to it as waiting on God. They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. And that's exactly what it does for me, listening for the voice of God. And I'd like to do more of it.
Anybody else want to comment on that person?
Also, I'd like to mention that I really enjoy seeing it in public services as well. I know when I was leading music here, I stepped out of it for a bit, but I was leading music for about a year there. And at first, when I would, introduce periods of silence, well, the piano player would do that tinkling stuff, and well, I didn't say anything about it the first time, but I told her after the service, I said, when we have a period of silence, I want it to be silence. I don't want piano tinkling, and so we did that, and you could see a lot of nervousness, but eventually people got used to it, and I think afterwards people came up and said, that's really good. I really appreciate having a period of silence.
I think the idea of that is very foreign to most of our culture. In fact, one of the things about young people today is that they just cannot be quiet. I mean, they cannot be around quietness. There's got to be noise and activity going on all the time. They get desperate when it comes to that. Do you want to comment on that, Deborah?
Well, I guess all I wanted to say was that I don't easily contact God just by being in silence. So more often I have to labor to enter that rest. I have to free myself from certain mental thoughts and emotional feelings, and it's almost like I have to prepare myself in order to get into that place where I can hear God and be moved upon by Him and sense His presence. I think silence is essential to hearing Him, and it's a part of prayer. As prayer, to my way of thinking, is two-way communication.
Yeah.
But Jesse Penn Lewis once said, sometimes you have to wrestle to pray, and sometimes you have to pray to wrestle. And I think that in order to pray, sometimes we have to wrestle to get into that place where we can hear Him. And I appreciate silence, but sometimes it doesn't do me anything unless I have wrestled some things off me or through.
Well, the Quakers, of course, many of you know that in their service that they just sit silent until the Spirit leads. No, there's no leader of the service. They want the Spirit to lead. And we've tried that in times past in some of our charismatic, in the early days when we had our charismatic Saturday night meeting in the back hall, the Baptist church where I was pastor. We would do that, and boy, I tell you, silence is deafening. When people are nervous, tremendous pressure begins to build after a while. But usually something good comes out of it in the corporate silence. I don't know what we do in most of our churches. Like you say, musicians mostly are very nervous about any moment of silence, and they usually want to fill all available times with something. And others seem to be more comfortable that way. But I think we need to look at that. There's another thing that, and we may go a minute or so over in this segment and just take it off the next one. He talks about those who are obedient to the will of God need not hurry. Boy, that really speaks to our culture in a way. Anybody want want to comment, how in the world do you slow down when everybody is waiting? You know, I have an expression I use a lot of time. I said, Sebastian, well, how are things going? I said, well, every time I look up, it's tomorrow. And how do you get off the merry-go-round or the rat race or the various other phrases that we use to this? How do we overcome our compulsion to hurry? Does anybody have that problem, or I'm the only one that has that problem?
I just need the answer.
I have that problem all the time.
Yeah.
The only thing that I've found that helps me with it is 1 Peter 5:7, casting all your cares on him, for he cares for you. And you know, to just have, when I'm in a situation where I've got a deadline, I've got to meet the deadline, and I know it's going to take some push to meet the deadline, that's a good time to reach out for grace from the throne and to say, you know, look, I don't think I can do this on my own. I need some help to be able to do it, and I'm just going to lean on you, Father, to give me what I need to get it done on time.
The Lord impressed me with something here about several months ago. I'm known as a driver who has a fairly heavy foot, and got in some trouble here a couple of months ago. But God spoke to me in a little bit. He said, where are you going in such a hurry? I didn't have a good answer for that at the time. And so for about 2 months, I've been doing something that's quite foreign to my nature and to my practice throughout most of my life. And that is, I've been driving the speed limit or below. And when you come off the interstate up there at Pine Forest Road in Pensacola, and you immediately go to a 45-mile-an-hour thing, it feels like you're going backwards. And my inner transmission did a lot of jerking, that is in myself, for a while there, but it's helped me in other ways. I'm not trying to be super religious or anything like this, but it was a means of starting somewhere to begin to slow down the hurry in my life. And sometimes you can take something like that, and it may be something different in your own life. You may decide, I'm going to walk here, or I'm going to walk slower, I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do that. And you break into this cycle of everything has got to be hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. Anybody want to comment on that?
Well, yeah, you know, since I have about a 45-minute or so drive to work every day, you know, I find that I try to leave, you know, on time or early so that I don't have to rush to work. But yet, it's funny, the times that I don't want to rush is like everybody else in the world is in a hurry and they're all honking at me and, you know, getting right on my tail and all that kind of stuff. And it's just like, and then you look around and you go, why is everybody in such a hurry? You know, it's like everybody in the world is in a rush to get to somewhere. And it's like, what difference is 5 minutes going to make in your whole span of your life, you know, if you're a little bit late or whatever. So, you know, that's made kind of an impact on me.
Well, I think it has something to do with your whole approach to God too, and in that it said something to me, because I come to God with my, you know, the things I want done, and they've got to be done. God, you got to do this tomorrow and the next day, and it spoils all the fun in it, because God's got other kinds of ways of doing things, you know. So it kind of upsets that. Well, we've already gone over several minutes here, so we better close out here, and then we'll pick it up in the next hour. We may just finish this up here briefly, and I want to spend most of the next hour talking about Dietrich Bonhoeffer and his cost of discipleship, and giving each one of these students here an opportunity to kind of sum up the course and some kind of summary of their reaction to it and the things that they felt best about. So we'll leave it here, and we'll pick it up in the next time. Well, welcome back to the last 1 hour segment of this course. And I think we will finish up with the last question that we had on your paper there for Thomas Kelly. And on page 24 of the little booklet, he says this. He says, "An awful solemnity is upon the earth, for the last vestige of earthly security is gone. It has always been gone, and religion has always said so, but we haven't believed it." And the question that I ask here is, what do you think he means when he says that the last vestige of earthly security has always been gone? I guess personally, that struck me very clearly because at my particular age, I have had less security from a worldly position in the last, I'd say, 5 to 7 years of my life than I ever had before. And I realize now, at this vantage point in my life, that I probably never had it. And we are living, at the time this program is being recorded, we're living in one of the most chaotic periods of life in the last number of years that I can remember. Worldwide depression has occurred, and the Soviet Union is breaking up into little bitty bits, and we're at this taping, which is in the very end of 1991, we're in a recession, even a depression in our own country, and there's very little security. The banking systems, for instance, that we have more or less depended upon in our country as being the symbol of the Rock of Gibraltar or whatever. Almost all of our institutions are in failing health and offer no real support to us. I think more than at any time I can remember in recent years, we are forced to realize that God is not only our supply, but He's our support. He's the only security that we have. There's nothing in this life. And it's unfortunate that we have to get in such bad shape in every kind of way, economically, culturally, every other way, before we realize that God is our only strength, that He is our only security. And that's the only security that we have. So that it struck me particularly there when I read that. Anybody else want to comment on how that struck them? Whether you saw that immediately, or whether you were offended by it, or what? Anybody want to comment on that?
Well, I think
Josh?
I saw it immediately, that you can't, there's nothing here on this earth that you can place absolute confidence in. There's nothing here that's that stable.
I think today is not even absolute. It's a matter of even relative confidence.
That's right. Yeah, that's true. If you're looking at the situation that surrounds you on a day-to-day basis, it's kind of scary to walk through it. But I feel confident, only in God. That's the only place the confidence can come from. I think some of my past experiences on the mission field, to where only God could come through like the champion that He is, helps me to be settled living in today.
That's right. I gave you a passage in the Psalms, which is one of my favorite Psalms. My wife and I were talking about it at the dinner table today, or the luncheon table, how that we've lived a very stressful life, very stressful ministry. We've been in and out of a number of church groups, and some of them we were cast out because of what we embraced at a number of times. And recently we've just kind of lived from hand to mouth here in the seminary, trying to make this go with all of the problems in the church context around us. But over and over we've recalled Psalm 46, which, as you may recall, was the psalm that comforted Martin Luther in the roughest days, when the whole ancient world, a world that had been in place for some 1,000 years, and that is the world of the Roman Catholic Church, or the church, and it was breaking apart at the seams, and he was the chief instigator of it, and as such was a focal point of Satan's devices and Satan's attack. And so this psalm was a tremendous blessing to him. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, and though the waters roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with its swelling. And that's been a comfort to me in recent months and recent years, over and over again. We will not fear, for we're fastened to the rock that does not shake. And it's in times like these that we understand that there really is no earthly security. And it's good that we have times like this, because we tend to depend on certain things. We depend upon our job, we depend upon this, and we depend upon that. And when they fall away, then the arms of the everlasting God are underneath. Well, we want to talk a little bit here now about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. One of my favorite authors. I don't agree particularly with all of his theology or whatever, but one thing is sure, this is a man, if I may be trivial here, I don't mean to be, who put his money where his mouth was, is a modern expression that we use. He put his life on the line. A singular person. He was only 39 years old when he died. I first came across his writings, or was introduced to his writings, when I was a seminary student in the early 60s. And in fact, I have the book that I purchased in 1961. I'll just hold it up here and maybe we can focus in on it. The Cost of Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. To give you a little thumbnail sketch of Dietrich's life, and this book has been very important in the lives of a number of people in the 20th century. But he was a German pastor, a student in theology when Hitler began to rise to power, and was one of the dissidents early on. As you may know, the German church at large embraced National Socialism, which was the party presided over by Hitler. And early on, he had disquieting and did not follow along. He was a dissident from the very beginning. He went through the war, and during the middle part of the war, because of his outspoken opposition to National Socialism, as Hitler's party was called, or Nazism, as we later called it, he was brought under a cloud, and he got out of the country and came to the United States. In fact, lectured and studied here in the United States for a while during the war. Then abruptly decided that there was no way that he could in conscience be part of the rebuilding of Germany after the war if he did not suffer the slings and arrows of the same fortunes that befell his own people. He had a real pastor's heart. And so against all advice, he went back to Germany. He was involved in the plot to overthrow Hitler. He wasn't involved in the attempt to assassinate him, but he was involved in negotiations with the Allies. And in Sweden, about 1943, I believe it was, he met with some representatives of the Allied forces to see if there was a way it could be worked out where if the overthrow of Hitler was successful, that they could negotiate terms and the rebuilding of Germany and all of this sort of thing. But the Allies were pretty hard-nosed about unconditional surrender at that point, so they refused this offer. So he went back to Germany, and very shortly after going back to Germany, he was arrested by the SS and spent a good deal of time. In fact, I've got a magazine just to kind of illustrate some of the things that I'm saying here. Let them focus on a magazine cover that I have, Christian History. I think it's very apropos because it shows Dietrich Bonhoeffer superimposed over a lot of swastikas and some of those gigantic political rallies of the late 30s that he inveighed against and was very much against. And then just inside the cover, right here's a picture of Buchenwald concentration camp where he spent many months in the early part of his confinement. Now, this wasn't where he was, his life was terminated. He was taken to another place, and tragically, just 3 weeks before the Allied forces overcame German forces and the war was over, he was hanged or shot. Some records say he was shot, others say he was hanged, and his body disposed of by the SS. Just to put it a little bit in context, what he was involved in, let me read you something that the leader of those German pastors who followed the Hitler line, or at least were not dissidents. It's hard for us to believe what I'm going to say right now, but this was a public pronouncement by the pastor who was the representative pastor of the churches that supported National Socialism. And this is what this pastor said. He said, "The time is fulfilled for the German people in Hitler. It is because of Hitler that Christ, God the Helper and Redeemer, has become effective among us. Therefore, National Socialism is positive Christianity in action. Hitler is the way of the Spirit and the will of God for the German people to enter the Church of Christ." It's hard for me to feature people being as deceived as that, but they were. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer stood against this. Some of the other things that, there's a few comments that he made, this magazine is full of them, but one of the things he said, peace is the opposite of security. I want you to think about that. We think that peace is the opposite of war, but he said peace is the opposite of security. We just talked about there's no security except in God. And the peace of God brings security, even though your circumstances are even very warlike. And the other thing that he said, one other thing he said, the only fight which is lost is that which we give up. And he never gave up. And God is looking for people like that. Let me read some of the most powerful statements of the book, The Cost of Discipleship. Let me say another thing. I went to Argentina and was down there for about a month in the mid-'70s. I was interested in discipleship, and there was a great deal of it going on in Argentina. I met with Juan Carlos Ortiz and a number of the other pastors down there and lived with them for a week at a time in 4 different areas while I was down there. And it's interesting that in Argentina, the so-called charismatic movement is not referred to that way at all. It's called the renewal movement. And it began by a group of missionaries meeting in the homes of the Darlings. That's their last name. And he was the top agent or executive of the Coca-Cola Corporation in all of South America, with headquarters in Buenos Aires. And in this great mansion there in Argentina, they would meet and read and discuss and pray over this book, The Cost of Discipleship. And the renewal movement in Argentina that was involved, that was born of the radical statements and the consideration. In other words, it blasted their notions of Christianity right out of the water. I was blessed to be able, in fact, I recorded an album of piano worship on the grand piano in that mansion that's still used in Argentina. The record is for several radio programs to come on. Some of the numbers in there, and I think I still have some copies of that. And I played on the piano. We recorded them on the very piano that they use for worship, and God brought worship into that thing. So it's been a very effective book. It really heavily impacted a whole generation of seminarians in the 60s as one of the most influential books that's there. But he has a lot to say. One of his favorite phrases is that of cheap grace and costly grace. Let me just read you that to give us a starting point here. Cheap grace, he says, is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance. Well, these are searching statements. Baptism without church discipline. Communion without confession. Absolution without personal confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ living and incarnate. But he goes on to say, costly grace is the treasure hidden in the field. You'll recall the kingdom parables of Jesus. For the sake of it, a man will gladly go and sell all that he has. It's the pearl of great price, to buy which the merchant will sell all of his goods. It is the kingly rule of Christ, for whose sake a man will pluck out the eye which causes him to stumble. It is the call of Jesus Christ at which the disciple leaves his nets and follows him. Another statement that struck me to the heart when I was as I've always been a seeker after God, but I was involved in seminary study. He said when Christ calls a man, he calls him to come and die. And that was the kind of radicalism that I was looking for in that time and still look for. To my own frustration, I've not always been able to live quite on that level, but I know that in my heart. And I think that is the truest statement of the call of Christ. That when he calls a man to come and to die. Which do you think has addressed you most often in your spiritual journey? This matter of cheap grace or costly grace. What did you think of? How did you identify with that? I guess the question is, when you read that in your spiritual journey, were there times when you were brought up short? I think what it addresses is this whole matter. Is there two levels of Christian fellowship, or should I say just Christianity? Are there the real intense ones, and then there's the nominal Christians? Or what can we say if we're not, as Bonhoeffer described, a true disciple? Are we not anything at all, or what? Is there two levels here, or three levels, or whatever? And what do we do with all the cheap grace? The easy believism, I think, is another phrase that he uses from time to time. What do we do with that, and how has this impacted you? Anybody want to comment on it? Do you want to comment on that, Todd?
Yeah, it just hit me when you said that. Just nothing that I even had prepared for. But, I grew up in the church my whole life, but I was never told that you had to have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. You never had to submit your life to him. You never had to obey his commandments. It was always stories and things like that we learned in our church service. It wasn't, they didn't even read out of the Bible for the most part, it seems like, if I can remember. So, now that I think about it, it's like, God, my whole life, growing up in the church was basically nothing but cheap grace. And it wasn't until I was a junior in college when I went to a Spirit-filled church that God really was able to reach down in there and show me what it was that I needed.
You.
Yeah. And, that just kind of hit me.
Yeah. Anybody else want to comment on it? Deborah?
Well, to me, I really liked what he said about cheap grace and costly grace. But he says that cheap grace is grace without Jesus. And to me, cheap grace is really no grace. To operate, to forgive and not repent, or to ask for forgiveness but not repent, to me you're not going to operate under any grace under those circumstances.
Well, let me remind you though that there is a grace that falls upon the unregenerate. Calvin called it prevenient grace, and were it not for the grace of God, that doesn't necessarily mean it's saving grace. I would say that that's some different, but everybody is a recipient of the grace of God, or they never draw the next breath to begin with. So before you get too far along that line. So I think, and a lot of these people, no one denies that many people in the institutional church are probably lost, but they are the recipients of the grace of God in just the fact that they are able to draw the next breath or whatever. The rain falls on the just and the unjust alike. So there is an element there that the grace of God comes to people. But what he's trying to point out is that if it's saving grace, it's going to be a grace with Jesus Christ. But go ahead.
Well, I was, to me, he was talking about Christians, and I was referring to the Christian walk, and I have operated under cheap grace. But I think in my presumption, I really wasn't operating under the grace of God in the circumstances. I may have thought that God forgave me when I asked for forgiveness, but didn't repent, but wasn't obedient, or didn't change.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, it's choice of words, but I felt like, cheap grace really was no grace in terms of God's, what I understand to be God's grace.
Yeah. Well, it could be a matter of semantics there, but I think no one can deny that he gets the point across, and that he is preaching a go for broke, confrontive faith, which is what I see in the book of Acts. When Peter stood up on the day of Pentecost, I've often characterized it this way, and he gave the invitation. He didn't say, why don't you folks come down here and join our church and help us out and help poor Jesus out because he needs your help. Basically, the thrust and the emotion of the Greek there indicates that he said, look, this is a great opportunity to enter into the greatest thing that ever was, and you better get it while you can because it's not going to be around forever. So, and he didn't sing, as I often say, 117 verses of Just As I Am without one plea, as good as that is, to milk the crowd. I mean, they had an opportunity to get in while the Holy Ghost was stirring the waters. And I think why I brought this up in just this fashion is that I sense that in a lot of this, the church growth kind of movement is that we want to make it easy for people. And I don't see that that is the job of the church to make it easy for people. And if we do, we're liable to fall into this matter of cheap grace. In other words, I've not found that people respond the best sort of way to the easiest appeals. And I tend to want to make it difficult. For a number of years, whenever I've had the opportunity to give an invitation, I wanted to say, look, almost like what he said, we're calling you to come and die. It sort of weeds out the easy believism and the Rice Christians right out front, but I think sometimes I sense that the emphasis in the so-called church growth movement, and I'm not against church growth, I'm on record a number of ways in that, but I think when you begin to emphasize on getting people in, sooner or later you're going to water down the requirements for getting them in, and you're going to try to make it easier because after all you got to get more people in, and that's the justification. And I think when that happens, then you fall into this trap that the confessing church, or the so-called confessing church in the continent, in the state churches that he was a part of, went in so often. Well, anybody else want to comment on that? Cheap grace, costly grace, that sort of thing, Josh?
Well, it seems to me like a lot of folks that you deal with for long periods of time that have lots of problems are the ones who are operating in cheap grace. They're just, if they would just go ahead and bite the bullet and go for it and let God do with them what he wants to do and go on with it, you seem to work your way out into another level of grace, to a consuming grace that you get that peace from going on with it. I'm grateful that I learned not to run around the mountain more than once or twice. There's people I know that was born again and received the Holy Ghost back in '73 when I did. They're still wandering around out in the plains somewhere, and every time I go home, I see them, and I wonder, why are you still, how in 18 years can you still be in the same place and not see where you could have gone?
Yeah. A number of years ago as a pastor, we dealt a lot in broken families, and God gave us grace to get families back together again. I remember one couple that came to me, and the wife was going to divorce the husband, and he was distraught and begging her, which never works real well either. So we began to deal with him, and neither one of them, they'd been church members for years, but neither one of them obviously were saved. And so I realized we were at a disadvantage because all that was on his mind, and so we'd get down and we'd deal with him, and we'd start praying with him to come through, and by the time we'd really feel the power of the Spirit, and he'd cry and all like that, and he'd pop his head up and he'd say, will this help me get my wife back? We keep on. Finally, we thought that he really gave his heart to the Lord and so forth like that, but it was very evident in the weeks that followed that the only thing on his mind was, whether he could get his rest. He'd do anything, He'd stand on his head, He'd even get saved if I'd get his wife back. So we didn't have much. And a month or so later, when she just was adamant and obdurate about doing anything in that direction, he finally just kind of fell away. Well, about 2 or 3 months after that, he came. He's about as low as any man I've ever seen, and he came and he said, I know it's all, I've given it all up. I've turned her, all of it. I just realized, he said, that I need God, whether she does anything ever or not. And I knew we were on good, solid ground then. Before, it was cheap grace. He was looking to get something from God, and he was willing to do anything to do it. But now he was realizing his own personal need of God, and he came to die. And interestingly enough, as a result of that, it took a little while, but within about 6 months, we put that couple back together again. And he was strong. He was strong in his faith. It was evident that he didn't need her in the ultimate issues of life, and that's generally attractive to women sometime, I think. It's not that we don't need each other, but when we understand we need God first and we put him first, then it really takes care of a lot of things. So I think that puts that up. Now, on page 10 in here, I've asked a question. What are the implications for Christian discipleship if we look upon obedience to the claims of Christ as being the impossible possibility? What do you mean, impossible possibility? Is he suggesting that you have to come to a point? Is discipleship a kind of a imitation of Christ, a kind of a slavish following of what we think Christ would have done in certain circumstances, or is that a trap? We kind of talked about that before. And is there something that we have to come to about the possibility of being a disciple of Christ before we can really begin to follow him? What does the possible or the impossible possibility have to do with that? You want to comment on that, Deborah?
Well, I think we have to come to the point where we realize that it's impossible to do it without God. We can't die ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
That we need him in everything. And the fact that most people realize, I think, that when they give their lives to Christ, most people realize that there's a cross ahead for them, and that it's an impossible one. It's not one that it's one that one would tend to shy away from unless one realized that only through Christ can we follow the road of suffering and come through on the other side.
Would you say that the death of the cross is a prelude to really any genuine Christian discipleship?
The death of the cross?
Yeah, our own personal death.
Oh, yes.
The cross, yeah. I think that's really what Bonhoeffer was talking about when he said when Christ calls a man, he calls him to come and die. It's interesting that he died as a martyr, as a modern-day martyr, and that may be entailed too. But I think what he was talking about was die to his own ambitions, die to his own thinking that he could ever be Christ-like or even approach it. See, that's what Kierkegaard was so gloomy about. He saw the impossibility, but he never really saw the possibility in any clear light so that he could work on it like that. Bonhoeffer did. And as a result, he was able to die then because he'd already died. What does it say? The fearful die 1,000 times, but the brave only die once. We might apply that to Christianity sometimes. What do you think when he says Christianity without discipleship is always Christianity without Christ? How did you interpret that? How did that hit you? Anybody want to comment on that? All right, John.
What I got from that is that I mean, you've got to be a disciplined Christian, or you're not really a Christian.
That's right.
And Jesus himself said it. He said, if you continue in my word, then you'll be my disciples, and you'll know the truth, and the truth will make you free. So you've got to do what he says.
Well, yeah, I think it's the essence of the Great Commission.
Right.
Also, because that's what he told us to do, wasn't it? He told the disciples, he said, go and make disciples.
Make disciples.
And he was very explicit about it. He didn't just say put a disciple badge on them and commission them as disciples. He said, teaching them what?
To observe
all things. Tas pantas, all things without exception that I have taught you. Anybody else want to comment on that? You want to comment on it, Todd?
Yeah, I was just thinking, this was kind of the way I was before I really came to know Christ. Was man, I was a Christian. I mean, I grew up in the Methodist Church. I was a Christian, but yet I was no more a disciple than this book back here. Mm-hmm. I mean, and I didn't have Christ. So really, I mean, I was really a hypocrite, because I wore a cross around my neck and said I'm a Christian, but yet I'd go out and get drunk and do whatever. And, it was like, what a shame that I put Christ through, when I think about it. But, God was able to get through and really bring me to him. But, So really, I agree. I don't think there is true Christianity without Christ or without discipleship.
I think the really telling point in all of this discussion is, I think most of us agree that discipleship is what Christ intended, and that we have to be disciples of Christ. The question is, what is the modus operandi? Of course, the discipling movement created quite a stir a few years ago, and I don't know that it's all settled out yet. But the abiding question as we close out these particular dealings here is, what is it? How do you become a disciple of Christ? How do you maintain a disciple? Does God use other persons? And spiritual mentors, spiritual directors have been used throughout the history of the church in the modern period. I think we have a great need for those who are experienced in the ways of the Lord to be mentors or directors, if you will, to other Christians. It's one of the great unmet needs in the church. And I think we're never going to get every Christian to this point of a sold outness, if you will, to the cause of Christ, unless the church takes seriously the task of Christian discipleship. And I mean that. And I think the church is not going to go any further. I think it's going to go more into triviality and frivolity and the entertainment mode and the soft, warm cocoon kind of an approach, which does not produce disciples of Christ or soldiers of the cross, until we take seriously the fact that we not only have to cause or bring people into the new birth, but then to train them and to disciple them into the very nature of Jesus Christ himself. Well, we said that we're going to take this last period of time here, the last 20 minutes or so, to give each one of the students here an opportunity to give a summary or some statement, a testimony of their experiences during this class, and maybe share with us some of the writers that were most significant to them. I'm sorry that David Mayo, you may have noticed it since the early going in this particular session, that he's not been with us. We haven't put the camera on him, but he had an emergency and had to leave. It may be possible for us to bring his testimony separately into this tape at some point, so maybe we'll leave a few minutes towards the end of this for the possibility of him adding his own testimony. But we'll go around here now. We'll begin over here on my left with Deborah Fulton. Deborah this is her last live class down here. She's going to be finishing up all of her materials for her master's degree, one of the first graduates of the seminary, and going back to Manitoba in Canada for ministry and other things that God has for her there. So Deborah, will you share with us, and if you will, just look right on into the camera there to share with all those who are out there your impressions of this course and what you've gotten out of it.
Well, first of all, I'd like to speak a little bit about my favorite writers. And although I really enjoyed almost every book and got a little bit out of almost every book that we had to read in this course, there were three that I chose that were perhaps my favorite, and I chose them for different reasons, and I'd just like to mention a few of those reasons, and then I'll say a little bit about what was most helpful overall in this course to me from reading the material we had to read. But I chose three authors, and the first one was John Woolman, and he was a favorite of mine because of the anointing that was on the book. And after I finished reading the book, and although he didn't say perhaps as much as some of the other authors, I really sensed the presence of God. I found that to be a tremendous little book, that one of John Woolman's. And I won't say too much about it because I don't really remember what he said, but I just remember the sense that I had of the presence of God after I finished reading that devotional book. But I also enjoyed and got a lot out of Henry Scougal's book, and he had some tremendous insights. He said things like, you become like the object of your affection. He said, kind of almost humorous things like people who are proud and arrogant tend to vex those that that they converse with, but most of all they vex themselves. And he said some things about humility and about pride that were really helpful and really insightful. And so I enjoyed Henry Scrugel. I got quite a bit out of him. But I also got a lot out of Evelyn Underhill's book, and particularly what she talked about in terms of intercession. And she said some things about intercession that I have thought but never heard expressed before. She said things like, any advance in prayer should be an advance in love. And it seemed like true prayer, what true prayer really was, and the effects of real prayer. She spoke about what true prayer was, and it was very interesting for me because I really believe in intercession, and I really have thought some of the things that she expressed when she talked about intercession. She said that for spiritual effectiveness, that love and prayer were essential, and I believe that. And she talked about that for prayer to learn to become effective in prayer, that there's a need for self-training. And I thought that was interesting. She talked about that you yourself have to persevere and learn how to pray. And I just believed the things she said. I've just experienced some of them, and I've thought some of them, but I've never heard some of them expressed before. So I really appreciated Evelyn Underhill. Now overall, the thing that most affected me, and I think will be with me from now on, and they've been with me ever since I first began to be affected or in this manner by these things. There were two things that really affected me. One was the sacrifice of some of these people. There's particularly people like Asbury, who was so sick, and yet he went out and preached regardless, and he suffered tremendous hardship, risked his life time and time again, and gave everything into the ministry. And it was tremendously impressive to me. There's a kind of an emphasis on balance that I've heard maybe a little bit too much in charismatic circles. And I've always been a little bit suspicious of it, maybe because I'm not that balanced myself. I've never liked to play a lot. I'm maybe a little intense, maybe too intense, but in my life. But I felt that some of the balance teaching that we've had in the charismatic arena has been almost borderline compromise. And people talk about burnout, and the fear of burning out. And frankly, I'd rather burn out than compromise. And I was just very impressed with the sacrifice of some of these men. They gave everything. And it really stirred in me, and it really solidified in me that I'm not on the wrong track if I want to give everything, put everything into doing what God wants me to do, everything. And I've really appreciated Brother Frank in the seminary because he gives everything, and he's been a wonderful example in his ministry and in his life. But these books really stirred me in that way because of the little autobiographies in the beginning of them, little biographies of some of these people, and it showed how they sacrificed so much and did such a good work. The second thing that really affected me about these books was the emphasis on humility. One of my greatest weaknesses, or one of my worst problems, has always been pride. And I was very moved by the emphasis on humility and on the necessity of humility. Became apparent to me from the effectiveness of the lives of these people that humility was a real key. William Law said that the noblest state of the soul was humility. And there is a lot of these writers spoke about the necessity of humility. And it stirred something in my heart to seek it, to love it, as William Law said, and to do whatever is necessary to remain humble and to be humble. When you look at Brother Lawrence and how he never got discouraged, and he never got discouraged, it seemed like, because he didn't have any faith in himself. He knew it was all by grace. And when he fell, he just got up and didn't allow himself to beat himself down. He didn't get depressed because his hope wasn't in himself. He was such a humble man. And so I really saw in these books the importance of humility in being effective in the kingdom of God. And I guess that's all I want to say.
Amen. Okay, Josh?
Boy, you said a mouthful, Deborah. I mean, you said everything I was going to say. I really relate and was really touched by the depth that the Holy Spirit could cause these men to write and put into print their feelings, their intimacy, how they, again, the sacrifice that they seem to present, and that humility. And I was really impressed with writers like William Law and Thomas Kelly, who could seem to just write a love story, basically, about what God was saying to him. And this is the kind of depth I'm looking for, and I believe that the church is looking for, and we've not received it in a lot of ways. I don't know whether we've had, not real model examples of these caliber of men. I'm wondering, where are these caliber of men today? Are they here? If they are, I'd like for them to stand up. I'd like to go sit with them for a while and just hang around them. I don't know. The question to me is, are we willing to take the time that these men evidently took with the anointing that they had, and seek God with all that was within us to receive the kind of revelation and revelatory acts that these guys did? They really presented a challenge to me to look into myself, to see where I've been yesterday, and to see where I'd like to be tomorrow. Where will I be tomorrow? How will I move on with the devotional level in my own life? I felt like I've had a very satisfying devotional life all my Christian walk, but when I look into the eyes of some of these guys and see into their soul, I see there's a lot greater depth than I ever thought could be attained. I was really enriched by the Quaker men, simply because they suffered a lot. They were not compromisers. They were willing to stand up or be stoned down, whichever came, for what they believed. And in our society here today, I find myself, more reluctant here in America to go out for the cause of the gospel and to strike a banner than I am in other countries. And I don't know whether it's just a call to go out in other places to do it rather than here. But that surprises me when I think about it. I was very impressed with Bonhoeffer, and again, his willingness to suffer. He tended to make a statement that about suffering freely, yet mastering it. I don't think I'm to that place yet. What tenacity some of these men had, like Bonhoeffer, to write the things he wrote while in prison, in diverse circumstances, in less than having any comfort in life. I don't know, as a career missionary, I give up a lot of things, but I don't think I've nearly given up enough to attain the level that I want to be.
All right, John.
Well, I had a difficult time selecting the books that I wanted to touch on tonight, and so my list is maybe a bit longer, but I particularly enjoyed The Cloud of Unknowing because of its dealings with the contemplative life. I believe that that's an area that the church needs a lot of instruction in today, and that I personally need to get into. Another author that I particularly enjoyed was Bernard of Clairvaux, and he very strongly points out to us that it's God who seeks us out first. Then, of course, the Imitation of Christ, which is a great classic of church history, and the points that I believe were very important in that book were the fact that we're called to be disciples of Jesus Christ and not just admirers of him. And there was a good bit of talk about the inner life versus the outer life, the internal working of the Spirit versus the external works that we do. And then, of course, in Brother Lawrence, I thought that was dealt with very well. I particularly liked the way that he was able to commune with God and have a relationship with God while he was in that kitchen working and having people hollering at him and to do this and do that and washing dishes and whatever, but still being able to, in fact, he said that he was able to get closer to God in those kind of distracting circumstances than he was when he was perfectly quiet. I also got a lot out of the book by Francis de Sales because he gave a lot of practical helps about how to commune with God. And of course, couldn't leave out John Wesley. I believe he's probably the most pivotal figure that has impacted the church today that we have. And of course, his very strong emphasis on scriptural holiness, communion with God, and the presence of God. And then last but not least, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was really my favorite, I think, in terms of him as being a modern-day Apostle Paul. And I believe that his theology is badly needed in the church today. I believe that discipline is one of the biggest things that needs to be emphasized in today's church. And what this all did for me is that it gave me a renewed emphasis on the development of the inner life. It's important to do the works of Jesus in the world and to help to work as a partner with God to establish his kingdom here on the earth, but we can't do it unless we first have that communion with God and get that grace from God. And that's what I got out of it.
All right, Todd.
Well, it's funny, John. A lot of the writers that you liked, I liked also. Some of my favorite writers were Augustine, Bernard of Clairvaux, Wesley, George Fox, Martin Luther, Brother Lawrence, and Francis de Sales. And I guess the reason I like most of these is because you got a real good glimpse of their personal relationship with Christ. And it was very convicting for me because it made me step back and look at where I was in my personal relationship and devotional life with the Lord. And I guess that was probably the most impacting of this whole class has been. It's just made me really look at my own life. And I guess it was neat. I'm envious of the relationship that these guys portray in their writings of the relationship that they had with the Lord. I think another thing that I liked about the class is these writers gave such good and practical ways to go about developing your devotional life. And there are times when we get into a rut of doing the same things over and over and over in our devotional life, and it just becomes stale. And now we have these little booklets that we can go to and try something different that has been successful for other people. So that was another thing I liked, and that was very beneficial for me. I look forward to the day that I become a pastor and can relate what I've learned in this class to the congregation that I'm a shepherd of, because I feel like this is something that's utterly important in our own Christian life, and is going to have an effect on the whole church as a whole. And I can't wait till maybe one day I can get the opportunity to minister on this to a congregation of people.
Well, I hope in all of this that we will see that whatever we have, whatever responsibilities we have as ministers, wherever we minister, is that it's very important that we emphasize and that we facilitate the growth of the inner person and the inner relationship of each one of our church members to Jesus Christ. Now, I'm going to save the rest of the time. We've got about 3 or 4 minutes right here, and I'm going to save this for David Mayo. We're going to record him at another time, but it'll be just following this segment. And so we'll end this up, and I'll give my farewell now and say it's been good to have this. I've enjoyed it immensely, and I think it'll be very helpful to you who are attending this class by video extension out there.
Hi, I'm David Mayo, and I'd just like to take the next few minutes here to give my little closing statement of what has been truly a wonderful experience in this class, the Spiritual Devotional Classics. And I'd just like to commend our great teacher, Dr. Frank Longino, for these past few weeks. What a joy it's been to study under him on these classics. And even before we got into these classics, these great cloud of witnesses, is that I will call them, for lack of a better term, that these men throughout those church centuries that we've studied certainly have brought much inspiration to me, motivation, and I'll even go ahead and say conviction because of the great testament of which they live their lives. And before we even got into that, the lectures on the Christian meditation and the mystics, and studying those great concepts throughout the church history were I thought very enlightening to me, especially when we got into the spiritual aspects of the spiritual life versus the carnal life, and how the spiritual world impacts us here in the natural world. And I thought that to be greatly enhancing my life, to not only see things in the natural, but yet our eyes are opened up into all the unseen elements that are going on to affect our world. And of course, moving on into the classics, to the people that we studied, I was just struck so much of the education by these men, inspired in that sense. You know, our media today portrays them as such Christian leaders, as such stumbling idiots and bigots, and just in a very narrow way. But these men that we studied, the true Christian leaders, extremely highly educated. And not only that, they took upon themselves issues such as slavery and gambling and these causes, very social-minded. I'm just, Thomas Coke, for instance, comes to mind, and Francis Asbury, John Wesley. These men here not only were truly spiritual men in every sense of the word, but they impacted their world. So they weren't just like heavily minded, no earthly good. These men dramatically affected the world in which they lived, and that was definitely a good inspiration for me. They said of John Wesley, he actually changed the course of English history, and that's the kind of person that I would like to be, to change the history of my world as big as I can make it. Probably the most convicting men that I read, Henry Martyr, who was also a brilliant mathematician. Not only that, he was a scholar and a master of Oriental languages, highly educated. And this guy had probably the most accurate use of time. I'll just, for an example, talk about the proper use of time, which was really convicting to me. I'm a late person, a late owl, so to speak, and so mornings aren't my best time. But this guy, he would say he rose late from having wasted a great deal of time in unnecessary sleep. He was filled with shame and a sense of guilt. Another place he talks about, I rose late and stupid from lying in bed too long. And that just really, I think of when I'm lying in bed sometimes, I'll think of that, and at least I'm more convicted when I'm lying in bed now, thanks to Brother Frank in this class and showing me this. But also the very practical how-to steps of which these guys led, expressed to me Jeremy Taylor, William Law, Brother Lawrence, and how this guy would, even in these tasks of the kitchen duties of which he had, that he would pray to God that the most use of his time would glorify God in that kitchen, a place that he didn't even enjoy. But because he asked God's blessings on a difficult task, something he didn't even want to be a part of, he enjoyed it through the grace of God, because he wanted every minute to be spent to God's glory and for his pleasure. And that has changed my attitude of things that menial tasks and things that I've involved with in my day-to-day duties, that even though they're not necessarily spiritual, I do them through a spiritual sense now, for only our Lord's pleasure. And that makes even these difficult tasks enjoyable and have real meaning and purpose. And that has been of great blessing to my life. Generally, it's just this class has given me an overall perspective of heaven. you know, just the awesomeness of eternity, that we're not just living in this natural world.